So I will begin. Thank you for coming after the lunch. I decided to speak instead of beginning explaining how I made the Studio Panorama, etc., that you are inside. I decided to show music. More concretely, the result, and one of the most recent results of our institution, in the sense that showing that, excuse me for my voice is worse than the voice of Fernando. Showing that, I hope that a little of my thought can be understood in the sense of why I made the Studio Panorama, how is the main tendencies of Studio Panorama, how I think the interaction between technology and composition and so on. And one aspect that I decided to show this recent piece is motivated by the coincidence that our colleagues, some of the colleagues of IRCAM are here, because we are just now developing a project, very interesting project, for violin and live electronics inside a series of a label of CDs and DVDs of a network of theater, tem lugares aqui também, that host some of the most important concerts in São Paulo. The name is SESC. SESC is a big, larger net of institutions in São Paulo and outside of São Paulo. And SESC has a label of CDs. I made one DVD inside this label, and now I proposed and was accepted a second DVD inside a collection of this label that pays homage to some masters of the avant-garde music. And it begins with a percussion player and conductor, Ronaldo Bologna from São Paulo, a fantastic musician, that proposed a CD which called Berio Plus. That the idea was to join some Brazilian composers around the work of Berio, or at least to record the work of Berio, and based on the instrumentation of that piece, invite some other composers to compose other works, and then make a CD. It was already made. After that, SESC continued the series and made a Cage Plus, a Ligeti Plus. Né? The CD Cage Plus I didn't see, but I know that it's already published.
It's in silence.
Huh?
The Cage Plus is in silence.
It's in silence. No, it's not in silence. It's already published. And then Ligeti Plus was very good made. And then I decided to make a Boulez Plus. Né? It was a coincidence that I received now. The colleagues of IRCAM, then created by Boulez and directed by Boulez so many years. Then it's interesting to show that. What was the idea? To record Anthem 1 and Anthem 2. In the case of Anthem 2, is the first surround recording, because the wonderful record that there is a CD recording. Né? And then I asked Boulez personally. Boulez immediately responded me through his secretary, because he was ill at the time. But 2 days after my email, he said to me that he was absolutely in accordance with this production. And Berio is the leader of IRCAM. How is the name?
The director? Madeleine.
No.
Andrew?
No, pas Gazo. It was very, very close to Berio. Cyril Gross wrote to me one day after that, giving me a password, and then I had the access of all the whole staff of Anthem 2 very sophisticated, very well made, and so I will have an assistant to study that, because we now are just making the violinist to learn the notes. And the score, then I invited a group of composers. This group of composers, each one wrote a piece for violin and live electronics. Not based on Boulez, but in the same direction of reflecting about live electronics and try to think about that, what means that, what could that contribute to the writing, musical writing, in the sense of the old composition. I say old because sometimes I have the impression I'm an old Trotskyist, an old composer, and a little believing in things that I see that is not more shared by the people. But I believe composition is something very, very strongly linked with 800 years of writing. And then that concept, not even for the score, but also for the loudspeakers. In this sense, the Studio Panorama is a kind of temple that believes in the subsistence of musical composition, in the sense of thinking in deferred time, not in real time. It's one of my ideas, because I think the thinking is not in real time. The thinking in deferred time. We reflect through memories, we dream, we don't think in real time. We think in deferred time. And then all the controls that we can have are better controlled. This is a big discussion, open, and so I accept many experiences and many possibilities of interaction and discussing also the boundaries of musical genres and so. But I think that the better control is if we really think outside electricity, outside real-time response, and thinking about sense and significance of the things. I'm not sure if I make me understandable, but it's the way as I think. But in this sense, I like very much any sounds that are extremely structurally constructed, and that independently of being for score or for loudspeakers. Then I believe on a musical writing, in the sense of a very good acousmatic music. And in this sense, I promote here, besides such projects that try to interact musical writing and even a traditional instrument as the violin with live electronics, I support and believe very much on acousmatic constructions of sounds. And my students will show today 3 examples of these new results in this other branch of our research, acousmatic music. Bon. This piece is one of the 6 pieces that were written in this environment around Boulez, but it's not based on Boulez. It's together with Boulez, as the CD Berio Plus was. There were composers that were together with Berio, and together with Cage, together with Ligeti, and so. In this case, one of the questions that I put to myself is how to make live electronics really interact with the writing. And I must admit that I have enormous respect towards a concept of Philippe Manoury that describes what he says, partition virtuelle. That is the way to think about electronics, not in one-way sense, but in a kind of a retroactive correspondence or correlation. And this piece is, I was conceiving that and decided to write a absolutely solo for violin. That I knew scriptio. Scriptio is a lost Latin word that means the act of writing. It's not scriptum, and it's not transcriptio. Transcriptio there is, already in Latin, because transcriptio is transcription. But scriptio is the act of writing, the act of really in different time calculating structures. That was the idea of the piece. And this piece is for violin, and is actually the same text that you have in your hand, 6 exemplars plus this one. I wish that everyone has access to have that, because the resolution of that is very, very low. Fala.
The scripture part, you disconnected entirely from any kind of technologic process.
Yes. Yes, I conceived the piece for violin, based on 2 harmonic techniques that I developed since many years, since the 80s when I was young. Módulos cíclicos and projeções proporcionais, cyclic modules and proportional projections, that are my personal techniques of interval speculations. I could derive all the calculations of my personal techniques per hand. I make with Open Music. Open Music is my tool for calculating quickly my structures. But I must say that I'm absolutely ignorant in Open Music. I had never time to go deeper in Open Music, and every time that I develop my techniques in Open Music, I ask myself why I don't have time to go deeper. But I just made my patches to deduce and to economizar, to save time, and then I derive my structures in Open Music. But I would not say that this is a computer-generated structure. It could be made by my head, as I made before Open Music. Before I made with patchwork, but before patchwork, I began that in '84, when I was 22 years, 22 years old. 84, 85, that I invented the cyclic modules, and it's not a question to explain how are these techniques. I was talking with him about that, but it's not the case to explain here these techniques. It's to show the music, to show the new results of Panorama, and to discuss a little my ideas of interaction. After writing the piece of Scriptio, then I wrote Transcriptio. And Transcriptio was already in my head when I decided to make Scriptio. And Scriptio has the root, the raiz, of writing. And Transcriptio is not Transcriptio. Transcriptio, as I said, there is this Latin word. If you take a Latin dictionary, there is Transcriptio until today, with one is. Here is Transcriptio. There is a crossing over Scriptio. In which sense? Not so complicated. There are 3 fenetres, tem 6 exemplares aqui. Pode pegar um aqui, distribuam os outros, e aqui está no final. There are 3 windows that can or cannot open along the performance of Scriptio, according to the fact that the electronics can or cannot not allow, but can or cannot generate a very basic process that I like very much, freezing, in 3 special moments of the score. There are 3 places in the score along the performance of Scriptio, of the text of Scriptio, inside Transcriptio, in which I open a window in the patch of Max MSP, and inside this patch it will be a random opening and closing of a function, through Fido and so, of a freezing. And according to the performance of the violinist, of the violin plays those notes that are allowed to be frozen exactly, or at that time that the inside that window of the main patch opens his gate, it can be frozen or not. If it freezes the note, then the violinist perceives that, and it causes attention because the violinist will not depend exactly just of the score, but must pay attention of what is running in the electronics. In this sense, I try to break this one-way relationship of playing and be transformed. And if he perceives that that note or the other one that is in that are colored in the score of transcription in that moment are frozen, then he must jump away from the writing of scripture and make a transcription and play the fenêtre, the window. You can answer me why French? Because one thing is this dependence of this correlation, not dependence, this correlation of this homage to Boulez in the context of Boulez. The other is that that was conceived together with to be played with a French violinist. That I don't need to explain more details here because it's not a so easy situation. But she played very bad, and I put aside and called a violinist of São Paulo. That's maybe the most important violinist of Brazil today, Cláudio Cruz, which recorded already transcription here in Studio Panorama. That's also a good example of our activity as a recording room too, because it was made here and so. And the reverb is from IRCAM, and the spatial motion of the violinist was simulated also by SPAT, in this case of this master.
Flo,
yes, please.
sorry to interrupt you, but to make a clear statement for my understanding. So that means when the live electronics somehow froze some notes, you open the phonetic for the interpretation of the violinist.
Yes.
So he has to play
To jump and to play phonetic.
completely what is written.
Yes,
here. So
exactly.
there's no improvisation.
And in such moments, the electronics is the most radical. These windows.
Okay.
Because there are the simultaneity of all effects. I hate this name, effects, but
my question is how dependent is these frozen from the interpretation of the violinist? What I mean is, what do you expect in terms of interpretation to
play exact?
No, my point is how much the opening of the window, the phonetic, depends on the player or depends on the electronics?
Depends on the score.
No.
In that moment, there is a sign to open the gate.
But you put a note there. But who decides that is going to be froze? Is the program or is the way the guy plays?
Yes.
Or ever?
That I will try to explain again. I try to make maybe my English is macaroni.
No.
But when I open the gate or the window of the patch, there is a random function through a metro.
Exactly.
Organized by a metro that opens and closes the function of recognition of pitch through a fiddle object.
See.
And it runs independently of the violinist. But the violinist play in that moment, I show the moment here precisely, of the first window. This is here.
This note here.
Here at page 2 is the signal to open this function.
For the guy that is control the computer.
No, that's control the clan regisseur.
Okay.
The diffusion.
Okay, yourself.
Yeah? Myself or another.
Okay.
Yes. Then I open the function.
Okay.
The fiddle will accept all the frequencies that comes inside, but to send to the FIDO object, I open and close periodically
The signal.
the signal, the
Okay.
gate of the sound, gate sound, gate audio. And then it depends how it plays and how exact are these very few notes that can be frozen or not,
Okay.
to be frozen or not.
So the answer to my question is clear now. That means depends on the precision of the
pitch.
the pitch
Yes.
that's played by the violinist,
And the time.
the response of the fiddle, because
Yes.
fiddle sometimes not so precise.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, I got it.
Exactly. And the time of playing, because
Okay.
if he says that Claudio Cruz plays precisely the E flat, but just in the moment where he make an accelerando or a expressivo ralentando in that figure that is allowed because he's a human and I'm a human too. And then he, instead of he make it something like that. And then when he tries to take this note, the gate is closed. He can play exactly the E flat, but if the function is closed by this metro, the fiddle will not receive any signal and will not freeze.
And what is the periodicity of this metro?
It is very, very. I don't remember exactly how I made it, but it's some seconds. So maybe every eight milliseconds or something.
It opens and
Open, close, open, close, open, close.
So your
As a flash.
So your purpose by doing this is to introduce
Some tension.
Variability and tension.
Yes, exactly. It's and the possibility to freeze in that point or in that one or in that or another.
It will be different for every interpretation.
It
Or
would
every
be different
execution will be
always,
different.
always. In the recording, I decided to make all the three windows because it was a recording, and then I decided to have all the windows played. Then I constructed for the recording, studio recording, artificially the frozen of that moment because it was a production. But at concert, there is a variability and a tension that is installed there between violinist and electronics because he must listen to the electronics and say and detect if it works or not. And there is a directionality. It's also in this case it's a kind of directional procedure that for my case is absolutely important. I think in directionalities the whole time. Directionalities in harmony, directions in densities, directionalities in processing. And in this case, these three windows has also a directionality of increasing the possibility not to freeze. So the first window has a great possibility to happen. The second, fewer, menor, como é que fala?
Less probability.
Less probability, and the last one, the minimal possibility to have that. And there are another directionality crossing this way, that is the radical transformations of the violin gestures and of the transformations that increases according to the window. So the first is more acceptable, the second is more radical, and the third is very radical, with crush of bowing and transformation, very loud transformations. There is an increasing amount of noise, according to the window, that are less probable to happen.
The greater is the noise, the less the probability.
Yes, more or less that. But we can. This is my plan. But in the praxis, it can happen otherwise. It can happen that the first window doesn't happen, and the third happens. And that installs a kind of tension and a double way between electronics and violin, because it's not even always play and listen to something that just transform. Although there are many pieces that I like very much that are in one way, that we listen very interested. Boulez, it's himself. I would say that Anthem 2 is in a kind of one-way thinking, because all that happens electronically happens as an interaction that expands the violin text, writing, but not in the sense that it installs a causability that crosses the way. It's always in one sense. And then, in this sense, I think Manoury is a little further, in the sense of thinking this flexibility of a relationship. That I try to think about that nowadays, because I made always pieces for instruments and tape, or pieces for instruments and live electronics in the last 15 years. And so, but most of them were constructed in one way, I would say. And I don't agree, I don't disagree with that. But I think this possibility to think this both ways and to instaurar, eu não sei se instaura, instantiation, to make emerge a kind of tension between the musician that plays a pleasurable tension, not a tension that destroys the musicality or makes music. For me it's pleasure. It's absolutely passion. It's not to cause a tension. No, a tension that makes a tension with a conductor, that can vary the time with the tempo. In the case of this piece, just to show structurally a little more deeper in the musical structure, that in this sense has...
Did you explain the meaning of the color notes yet?
The color notes are the possible freezings.
The possible freezing notes.
But you have different colors. You have green and red.
Just to show that there are
Any
two.
of the colored notes can open a phonetic.
Yes.
And there's a difference between red and green?
If there are some frozen notes, there are these colored notes, green or it depends on the. In the third wind there are three colors, three possible. It's important to write the color. Why? Because the violinist, of course, a very good violinist will play all the notes perfectly. But if he knows that the colored notes are the notes to be eventually frozen, he can play otherwise in order to provoke the frozen. To stay, for instance, a little more in the E flat, or to provoke it's a kind of decision that I can allow through the color. In the case of this piece, I would like just to say, in order to introduce you a little, the most of you know me very well here, but the other ones that don't know me very well, how I think structurally the piece. The piece is based, it has practically nothing with technology that. It's purely musical thought, and maybe in this sense very tributary to Stockhausen, for instance, to whom I was very close musically and personally in the last years of his life. So here you see 11 groups of notes, each one as a kind of character, and each one has a distinct density of the other one. There are 11 groups from 1 to 11 notes, and every group has a kind of counterpart or opposition or mirror. For instance, here, this is a accelerando group of 7 notes. If you see the number of notes, 7 notes, 9, 6, 10, 8, 5, 4, 3, 11, 1, and 2. Then there are 11 groups from 1 until 11 notes. But temporally, each one has a character. Then here is an accelerando. This accelerando has an inversion or a retrograde through the retardando here. This group, for instance, is periodicity. This group here is aperiodicity. This here. This group is appoggiatura plus note. This group is note plus appoggiatura, and so there are always an opposition of character between two correlating then a pair of groups of distinct densities. But you can ask me, how do you can make that if there are 11? There is just one group that has absolutely a unique emergence in the piece. That's the group of one note. That is, in my opinion, one thing that we lose very much in the contemporary music. That's the note repiqué, a la Mozart, that we lose in contemporary music, especially after the serial phase, where all the notes were in a very caricatural image of Weber that I love so much, but I allow me, excuse me, Weber, in the spirit of Weber, but to make a kind of caricature. Each note, we lose after that paradigm that was enormously important for the new music. We lose the pleasure to repeat the note. That was so pregnant in Mozart's music. And the sense that I love Mozart and still believe is another kind of belief. Now I said about Trotsky, which more. Mozart, I believe that was the biggest composer of all times, in my opinion. I like Mozart. Mozart brings me the hands every time that I listen. How is possible that? Then I made my own homage to Mozart in this small figure. That's a kind of Mozart, even in the score, a la Mozart. And this one note because there is no other pitch in this group. And all the piece, it's not a question to analyze that. It would be boring. But just to say, all the piece is developed through the cyclic modules. That's one of my techniques. This formulation of melodic structure is already a cyclic module of a harmonic entity of 12 notes. That derives the whole structure of 11 groups. And all the piece are contractions, permutations, and developments of this profile, this main profile of 11 groups. And crossing the characters. For instance, when the ritornello, this is the pregnant repetition that I insisted to make in order to make clear for the audience the formulation of this perfil principal, main profile, that happens following the presentation of the main profile. We see already the beginning of some manipulations. For instance, the groups remain the same, but the character begins to change. If the group has exactly the same character of temporal distribution of values, it inverts the mode de jeu. For instance, what was legato becomes staccato, what was staccato becomes legato, and so on. If there are some begin of transformation of this distribution, for instance, the retardando here that becomes to be disturbed here by the displacement of these small figures inside the figure. Do you see here? It begins until the end of the piece, until the retardando becomes a rallentando. It's the beginning of a process. Then it keeps the mode de jeu. The attacks are exactly as such. There are some laws of structural construction of the piece. I would say a kind of post-serial thinking of very controlled structuring. And the whole intensity is inverted. All the intensities that are in the main profile, forte becomes piano, and the intensity crosses absolutely in a mirror structure when ritornello is played. So such structures. But I will play the piece now, and we will a surround version, and you will see that, for instance, at the beginning, very high register of the violin, un trillo, and then very small in microtone. This is properly a very radical proportional projection of the main profile that are there. That I make all in open music. I define my limits and make a radical or less radical compression of the structures to derive my deformations of the profile in the sense of the envelope, but not in the sense that this distortion will destroy the recognition of the profile, because the profile, according to my ears, are the most important information to keep relationships between musical structures. Please.
What do you mean proportional projections, like interpolation of values?
No, it can be interpolated or not. Just
to understand.
Just to keep the proportion of the intervals and compress or make a dilatation beyond or not the musical the original register, or range more than register. In the case of the beginning, there are a radical compression and a transposition in register. There is also directionality in the sense of directional hearing, listening, of displacement of the violin line of the high register until the last fourth string, the G. And when the instruments achieves the G, then emerges the main profile. It's a kind of discovery of the whole register of the violin, and then when he achieves the low string, emerges the formulation of the main melodic structure of the piece. What could I say more? From the point of view of the electronics, I will show briefly. What I made. I sent to trash something. Ok.
Ctrl Z.
Eu fiz. Quick. Eu sem querer aqui bati, foi pro trash aqui, quase que me apaguei um negócio. Bom, what I make? This is the patch. I must say, it's disturbing for me to be here in front of programmers and genial heads of ERCAM or programmers of Brazilian colleagues of mine. I am absolutely a composer that tries to make my patches and develop my research, especially in spatial domain. In this sense, this studio is now, from the last week, because it's very, very new, this Meyer sound, we have here a dome of 16 loudspeakers to develop research in spatial composition that is, from the point of view of research, the mainstream here of Studio Panorama. And I'm developing a kind of patch in Maxim SP that I call Music Pan Space, together with some researchers, especially a mathematician that helps me very much, André Perrota. And we are now planning the Music Pan Space with a three-dimensional object, very interesting research, with which I can define exactly the position in the space of each loudspeakers, and the programs, the patch, calculates my trajectories made through the distance-based amplitude panning, the BAP, through this definition of the loudspeakers. I can show briefly afterwards the man of that. Here in the patch, we see an incorporation of a small part of my music pan space there, making some trajectories that distinguish in space the effects that I apply in the piece. There are basically 7 types of transformations of the violin, and each one has 7 setups. Each one not. 5 of these 7 have 7 setups to be chosen according to my decision, or to the decision of the interpretation of the electronics, of the people that are in front of the mixer, of the patch, independently of the violin. and these are the fenetra, when I open or not the functions of this fiddle freezing in the middle of the scripture. But we can afterwards show more, and then I will learn something, because they will say, no, then put here this object is much better. Then I will provide that. But now just listen to the piece, okay? Played here recorded here, mastered here, played by Cláudio Cruz. Fantástico. Hã?
Você vai começar daí ou da primeira página?
Vou começar da primeira página. Mas aqui tá muito ruim, né? Vocês sigam por aí. It's better to follow with the score, because there is very... a last comment. I think that for me, aesthetically, is very important, is not to limit the music to the stage. The experience with the loudspeakers has convinced me to, although I began that in an orchestral piece of 85 when I was 23 years without having practically any experience with the electronics. And I decided to deconstruct the orchestra in the theater. The piece calls Pan, my obsession by this myth, that after some years, in 94, conducted me to ground. Como é que fundar, gente? Found the studio Pan Aroma, taking a word of James Joyce. And paying homage to the concrete poetry in Brazil, that began here in Brazil in 53, through the Augusto e Haroldo de Campos and Despinatari, and one of the main books of this concrete poetry was exactly Panorama do Finnegan's Wake, taking the word Panorama of Joyce himself, by Finnegan's Wake, and translate some fragments of Finnegan's Wake, Panorama do Finnegan's Wake. It's a very paradigmatically book in the Intelligentsia in São Paulo. And then I took this as, it shows my obsession by the myth of Pan. But let's listen. Okay.
Just a question for you have 7 kinds of effects that in patch.
Yeah, I hate this word effect. I use this word, but I hate it. But
7, I mean,
transformations.
Okay.
Yeah.
And which are they? Reverb? I could not read.
There is a kind of pitch shifting with delay that I reconstruct a kind of pendulum that was a plugo in the ancient cycling plugins. That there is no more this plugo. I rebuild this plugo, and then there is freezing. There are reverb, freezing, delays, ring modulations. And what more?
Okay, just to know what will happen.
Okay. And a kind of the result is a kind of harmonizing. Is a kind of multiplication of interval. It's important to say something before we begin. Two things to complete the commentary about the boundaries of the composition in space. I try in practically all my pieces to not to delimit the space of performance. So in this piece, for instance, the violinist begins together with the noise of the audience outside the stage, playing the trio, and he comes. And when he comes, the audience will perceive and make silence. And then it begins and crosses an itinerary in the stage where are placed some microphones, all that explained in the bula, in the instructions of the score. No? And at the end, he goes out of the stage and appears. And the result at the end, through this freezing transformation, is to leave a kind of traces in the air. No? And he passes and finally leaves here and goes out, and what happened when he made this crossing is really this motivation of tracing. No? Another thing is very quickly is to think the function of live electronics. Besides this strategy to make a dialectic way and interaction, not a one-way transformation, I think there are three main aspects of multiplication of the live electronics towards the musical writing. The live electronics are, in my view, always a kind of multiplications. In this sense, I'm very Boolesian. But in which sense there are these multiplications? I think there are three aspects. One aspect is the spectral. There are these transformations of the spectrum or spectra of the instrument. The other is the structural, how structures are delayed or contraposed or multiplied in the sense of harmonies and so on. And the other is spatial. I say in Portuguese espacial, espectral e estrutural. As three mi bemóis. Esse in German is mi bemol. Coincidentally, it's the first note to be frozen, but it's just a coincidence. The spectral, espacial e estrutural. There are the three main aspects of multiplication of the live electronics towards the writing, as I see the question. If someone comes and says to me, no, there is a fourth, and convince me, I will adapt a fourth one. But I try to...
Must begin with this.
Well, yes, it was a long question, a long question, and I was convinced that there is no other than these three. Yeah. But I'm very open. I'm agnostic, but if someone convinces me that God exists, I will be religious. I'm not a dogmatic in the sense that I'm open to be proved. No? Otherwise. Okay. Fenetre 1, the window 1. Now jump to the left. Back to the score. No? Same place. Fenetre 2, window 2. The first one was a contraction. Here is an expansion. Back to the score. Violin will arrive at the loud G at this moment. The G will. Enunciation of main profile now, né? And ritornello. Violin without electronics. Ritornello. Third window, terceira fenetra. It closes with my Mozart and then comes to the Paganini. After that is Paganini thought of developing all the possible. Always based on the profile. Contraction, expansion, permutation, that's the same profile. The whole back. A fantastic violin, a Galeano of 1750. Plays the panorama. Quase Stradivarius. notes. Playing fragments by memory of the main profile, intercalating with the G. Comes from here, goes to there. That is. Thank you. Thank you very much. Wonderful violinist. Claudio Cruz, fantastic. Superb. To work with a musician as Claudio Cruz is a privilege. It's a fantastic. He played all the things. All the things. Fantastic. I show, just to finish, I show very quickly the music pan space. Just to introduce a little the research. So I will open the compilation just to show the patch is that one. With that, I and my students, for instance, Alex, produced all the spatial trajectories of his piece with this tool. It's basically a tool with which we can even design per hand. It's very basic for the people here, sorry, but or to develop through mathematical functions of, if we change here manual design to geographic figures, we can choose spirals and change the values and the parameters of these figures and so in space, and this can produce trajectories over, in this version, over to 8 loudspeakers, and I can record the result of all that so that we can put or live through microphone or through audio files until 8 and make 8 simultaneous trajectories mathematically or per hand defined, record each one here in the trajectory recorder and overlap the trajectories and make a kind of polyphony of space. The actual research is to develop all this part here in a three-dimensional object, and then it will be that one that has provisionally the face of Pan here, but since it's a Picasso, probably I should pay rights and then I will change the figure. And then the research now is to develop the same ambience of programmation and calculation of mathematical models of trajectories and the possibilities of polyphony of space, but here with this object that if we make so, we have a three-dimensional representation, you see? And through the speaker calibrations page, we can define how many loudspeakers we will wish. For instance, 53 loudspeakers, as is the case of the next Biennale in the theater. and then define each one in this three-dimensional. For instance, if I say here, instead of 2, the default, I say 53 loudspeakers, I can define here the first loudspeaker here, for instance, and then I define here the first loudspeaker will be here, there, and so here. So where is that? I move and see exactly where it is. Then I go to the next one. So I wish to define now this loudspeaker 7. That will be here, and there, and here. So, for instance, then we can define each one of the loudspeakers. How many loudspeakers we wish. That's the point that's very interesting. Then we have the trajectories calculated by this the BAP, distance-based amplitude panning, and as long as we have the same loudspeaker disposition, of course, of the planning, we will have exactly the same movement of the theater.
Do you know the WFS system? Do you know the?
Excuse me?
Have you ever knew about the WFS system of the camp?
Wake synthesis.
I've heard many about that, but never seen. Never.
Because they are facing the same problem, in fact. They are
Yeah?
trying to.
It's the same.
But
His
it's
face.
not the same
His
thing.
same.
It's
His
not the
face
same
just.
thing because they changed all the setup. They put 47 loudspeakers altogether, and they kind of simulate the natural way of spreading the sound.
But it's totally different because this is based in wave synthesis, no?
Yeah,
And it's a wall of loudspeakers, totally different of this conception. It's very interesting, but I have no wall of loudspeakers. I have a dome of depending here 16.
Yeah, but they did that exactly because they found very difficult to place the sound exactly in a point. So they came up with the solution that really it worked very well and depends from
I
the
believe
sound.
that. I'm not a programmer. I'm a composer. If I, it's in the near of this staff of European researchers. It's probably I find that fantastic. Probably they find that is okay because I'm not. What I fight to be fantastic is my notes.
No.
The programmer, I'm alone. I'm trying to construct.
No, but actually, there is no perfect system. So at IRCAM, they are very pragmatic and they use many different systems depending on the.
Depending on the.
So right now, they have three. They have the WFS. WFS has this, rows of loudspeaker with a special mechanism where you simulate the wave front, and it's very good, as you said, for locating sound. But they have still a hard time with WFS for azimuth, what you call azimuth, sounds coming from heaven and sounds coming from hell. So now they also have a dome. They also have a dome with those and other speaker, but actually they use ambisonics modeling for the dome. But they also have, as they always had, clusters of 4-8 loudspeakers with a max match controlling a VBAP.
Yes,
so
exactly.
it's pragmatic. People are pragmatic. You can't say that there is the perfect solution.
Exactly.
So you choose depending on what you want to achieve.
Yes. What I found important here is that now I can choose the number of loudspeakers.
Yes, exactly.
Because in the first version of my patch, it was until 8. Then I was limited to 8 because we have 8 here to compose. But there we arrived to a situation where we can make live in the theater and control over.
But I will add something with the WFS and the ambisonics, which means thousands of loudspeakers. It's extremely precise for space modeling, controlling, and motion and transformation. With ambisonics, you can, for instance, program rotations of a sound scene. It's extremely precise. But the loudspeakers are small loudspeakers, which are not very good. So there is a
depends on the loudspeaker too.
Yes. But now with the traditional 8, 4, 8, 16 loudspeakers. You got Meyer sound, blah blah. It's not it's not as precise, but the quality is fantastic. So it's a trade-off. You choose.
Yeah.
You choose. It's a trade-off.
I must visit with calm
Yes,
earcam
yes.
because I worked many years with ambisonics, but ambisonics has a kind of projection of wave in space that has depressions, and I found that the resolution of the design was not so precise. I discussed that with Neukomm in Switzerland. That was one of the researchers of ambisonics at that time, and he explained me that there are these peak and the depressions, and according to the wavelength in space, it can be make a trajectory making with less definition in the middle of the whole. And I perceived that empirically. And then in that time when I worked with ambisonics, I tried to compensate that with a kind of curve in the middle of the room, so that this depression was a kind of compensation that brings me the definition here in the middle of the room. Then I began to listen more precisely, this crossing in the air. But I was not convinced by ambisonics, but I'm just a pragmatic composer. So if scientists showed me, it's fantastic.
I think the truth is the ear.
Yes,
That's what you like.
yes. And my has tinnitus since many years, and it's a problem. Maybe it was a little too loud today because
No, not at all. I was asked if you start. I had to say so. I would ask you to play louder.
Yeah, really. Maybe you have tinnitus too.
No, I don't think so. I enjoy it. It's very loud. But anyway, it's another story.
I have around 13 hertz. That is my companheiro. That's almost every day. Today is strong. A café. Very strong. I don't know if it's here or there, but it's. If I sleep not so well, it remains the whole day. Today, for instance, is very strong. It's already. It begins at 3 o'clock in the morning of 13 January 2005. three and a half. I was in Germany as guest professor in Cologne, and then I don't know. At 3 and a half, I jumped from my bed and called my wife. Nowadays it's not even more my wife, but my tinnitus is still there. My wife is away. Tinnitus remains. And then I called Regina. What's I'm listening.
Salve Regina.
It begins very, very strongly, and then make a directional decrescendo along the way, but it stays there. So my woman, goodbye, but the noise stays. Okay, question or change or what?
Well, we should have more space for more, 1 or 2 questions. If you have a question. No online question.
I was wondering if a further parameter would be gestures, you know, because that doesn't start with S. Maybe it can take a place in your composition.
Gestures?
Gestures. Because
Yes, totally.
they're not just structures. They're not just the spectra.
Yes.
What's for?
Non dimenticare che sono italiano.
And space. And they are not. So, I mean,
Gesture is the soul of Brazilian Italians.
yeah, but probably it's gestures.
Gestures.
is already there. I mean, but I just wonder because what we heard is also really a way of structuring gestures in the space and spatial way, etc. But there are kind of morphological units. I think that they are not simply structural. They are really
Of course.
No?
I try to totally. I try to organize, but my ear is in the first place. And the ear is also a memorial ear of the history of the violin. And when I said joking, it now is jumping from Mozart to Paganini. It's not a joke. It's really a serious thinking. He's joking the manner of speaking, but
As a
it's in my
reference
head.
for you.
Hmm?
As a reference for you.
Of course.
As a historical reference
Yes.
for you.
And in this sense, I'm very, very Barryan. I'm very, very linked to burial the whole time. We had at school, Silvio Ferraz just came here. He's an old friend of mine since 14 years old. And we are a kind of Barryan school, Thrugville, Corrêa de Oliveira, Gilberto Mendes, and so. And I think it's very strong, the thinking of gestures, of yes, musical semantics, from musical writing and from musical history. In this sense, I believe very much in the deferred time, because it's only possible if you forget the real time and thinking the listening as materials to be constructed and the expression of writing. I respect what Fernando showed here. Is another approach. It's approach of improvisation and boundaries of music and no music is another thing. But in my case, the Studio Panorama is more in the sense of composition in the sense of writing. And paradoxically, not related exactly with electronics, without electronic thinking structures. No? But when thinking structure, thinking through gestures, through the ear. And in this sense, I'm very traditional, because I maybe I stay alone and defending the composition named by a composer with references to Stockhausen, to I don't know. I love that. There are different approaches.
I have a question for you and for also for all the professors which are here, which is related to speciality. Well, I mean, we have apart from those questions of what type of algorithms we can use to make sounds move on space, electronics, wave field synthesis, and so on. We have a question about numbers of speakers and of course room acoustics and so on. But which I think it's very interesting because well, in each studio you have a different sound and so on, which is it's fine by me and so on. But then also we have a kind of a tradition of making electroacoustic music in stereo for more specialization, or quadraphonics and optophonics and so on. Then there's a kind of a problem in the way I see of that each piece, especially when you design your specialty previously on studio, and when you take it to another studio and you have a different type of setup of loudspeakers, then
you must adapt.
You must adapt, and there's a great probability that the space will be distorted. So my thinking was what you think about, and other people here, about would it be interesting at some point to think about kind of
neutral. When we compose, we think neutrally. We have a given system, but we think how this thought or construction or elaboration or speculation or will function otherwise. That's the main thinking, I think. We must compose concretely with the means we have, but we must imagine and elaborate something that survives independently of the system which we have. That's my opinion. But the adaptation is over the whole history of music, because the instruments are other instruments too. If Claudio leaves his Galeano, is a fantastic Galeano, his violino from 17th century 50. It's almost an Stradivarius, cost the Panorama together. If he leaves that and plays in a Veril violin, It's a, huh?
He can
I don't know if there is a video. Video is a shit. Excuse me, it's not. It's filming. It's a very interesting producer. Musical instrument. At least violin. At least the violin. I think. I don't know if video constructors.
Play video.
Play video. Maybe the piece will be wonderful. We must to not get that process. I don't know. He must adapt. No?
But I was thinking about what happens in the commercial part of surround. So thinking about theaters for cinema and so on, which they made a type of standards so they can have the same almost
Difficultly, probably we will never have that. A patronization of the system. Hopefully, yes. One of the most interesting thing is to adapt, to play with this variability of sound. That's the main research now with the MPSP, to make that live and to control live with different setups. Maybe the same idea or similar ideas that will be transformed in another situation. I don't know if the colleagues have something to say about that.
In open music, I'm a developer of open music. We exactly try to address this issue by, for instance, when we deal with spatialization, and that's what Flo answered to. We clearly separate what's the specification of a spatial scene, where are the sound in the space, and the actual rendering into a multi-channel audio file or ambisonics file or whatever. So we keep these two information separate. What's the setup and what's the spatial configuration of the sound. That's not very easy because very often the way you design, the way you specify the configuration is also a little bit related to the setup. For instance, if you have a dome of speakers and so you can do lots of things, and when you want to do it with 8 speakers or 4 speakers, you cannot. But what we can do is try to do our best after. And so we separate this compositional aspect with the rendering, which is more related to sound engineering. And a little bit like the composer says, I'm the composer, I think of structure. Then the compositional environment also has to separate what's the composer's world and what's the engineering, technical aspect that relate to how do I render a given sound configuration in space into a given setup. And this we can rely on techniques being more and more accurate for this. But the idea is this: is you could have your same setup, and in 5 years try it again in a new studio and move it.
Must adapt everything. And we must admit one important thing, and a very interesting thing. Space is not so well perceived as pitches. Pitches, every small deviation you perceive. Space is a very como é que fala grosseiro? Rude parameter of perception. But it's one field in which if we make few things, we listen even worse the sound. We must speculate very highly to listen a small amount of our speculation. But if you give up and don't speculate in space and don't really control, then we listen nothing. It's curious. It's something that we sacrifice very much energy to have a very parsimonious result of which we intend to do. But if you give up, we lose very much. It's a curious parameter. It's not as pitch. Pitch is very precisely, semantically and perceptually. It's the Pierre Schaeffer spoke about the supremacy des auteurs, and he was right. The pitches are really very predominant, and in this sense, my work is very I develop my techniques.
Don't you think that it's called historical practice in tonal music about the importance of pitch?
I think tonal music was possible because of the importance of the pitches, not the contrary. All the systems are prevailed because of the importance of the pitch perception.
But it's a kind of metaphor of space in name pitch.
Yeah,
we say
it's
lower
true.
or higher, and
But this is general for all the parameters because we don't have musical
but
words.
in space it's not metaphor. It's not metaphoric space. It's lived space.
Yes.
It's a
If
visual
we see,
aspect.
for instance,
It's a visual metaphor. Not
it's not visual. It's not metaphoric.
when you say low and high, it's a visual metaphor.
Yes,
It's
yes,
not
yes.
aural metaphor.
Yeah. Yes.
That's the-
There is
and
also a
we
metaphor.
talk about aural metaphors.
But
But with space, we do not treat space in these terms, especially in electroacoustic music. Don't you think? Space
I
is
think
not-
all the things are metaphor. All the things. Philosophically, there are only metaphor in the world, I think. There is no absolute thing. All the things are metaphor, are translations of crossings.
But for example,
The language is a metaphor of the thinking.
Yeah, but
The language is already
but we hear the violin there and there. It's not metaphoric space. It's lived space.
Your mayor loudspeakers are not metaphorical.
Yeah.
They are concrete.
no, but the point is, do you think you are going to perceive space differently if you were a hunter,
hunter.
a caçador?
Sure.
Yes, of course. The function plays
Yeah,
a...
So, for a hunter, this space is a...
Or a blind man.
Yes. So that means actually there's the way the space is conceived and the way we use the space affords some more perceptual issues than others. That's I think what he's trying to say.
Yes.
Especially, I
But
think
metaphor are everywhere.
Metaphor is a way of thinking, but the point is, I think, is that means we are adapting our sense to the way we use our sense somehow.
And in this sense, I told about the tradition of tonal music that we hear stay stopped in a place, we don't move, and so we treat as metaphoric the terms about pitch. And when we are moving in space, we treat specialization of sound not as metaphoric terms, not in metaphoric terms. It's
But pitch,
actions.
but when we listen to pitches,
pitch too.
we are not thinking in we describe pitches
Yeah.
as metaphorically,
Yeah.
but we listen pitches.
Yes.
Listen pitches.
Yes.
And
Yeah. I understand what you're saying.
when we begin to make a discourse, you use metaphor. But we listen pitches. And the pitches are more accurate to be perceived as space. A não ser que, como é que é? Unless you make a very progressive, a sine wave movement. That's the circle. Then we have a very concrete figure, very simple figure in space. But it's
So I'm sorry to interrupt this discussion, but we have to finish because we're going to have a little break and we'll have a round table, and after we're going to have the
tem
concert.
round table. Okay.
Yes, so
Maravilha.
we
Thank
don't
you very
know,
much.
we have we're 15 minutes left.
I will make just a comment, very
course.
interesting. A last comment. Leibniz has Leibniz has a fantastic insight about space. He says, time is the coordination of existence, and space are the coordination of coexistence. That's fantastic, to understand space. He speaks in French because it was in a letter. L'espace, c'est l'ordre de coexistence. Le temps, c'est l'ordre de existence. Very interesting. Time is existence, but space is relationship. That was the discussion between Leibniz and Newton. Newton believed on space as absolute thing, and Leibniz said it's relationships.
Yeah, yeah. In these terms, Leibniz transposed the Kantian terms of space, you know.
Yeah,
Don't you
yeah.
think? Yeah.
Leibniz musically is fantastic. It's fantastic.
Phenomenology.
I think it's. I'm not sure if Leibniz is correct or not. If maybe Newton is correct, I don't know. But musically, Leibniz is correct. I think it's relationship, coexistence, and.
After all, he invented the binary language.
Yeah, maybe dialectics.
For instance.
Okay, thank you very
So
much.
thank you.
It's nice.